I'm about to turn this microphone over to our panel. We have a really interesting and I think exciting discussion coming up, and I simply want to say a word or two about the panel and the topic. This is, among other things, an election season, and people are looking forward. People are looking forward to what's going to happen over the next several years and several months. In particular, what's likely to be happening at the federal level in education? What have we learned from the past? What's going to happen in the future? And we've got three people who are wonderfully positioned to help us do that. I'm just going to say a word or two about them. They're going to introduce themselves. So Ginny Edwards, who is the editor-in-chief of Education Week, is going to moderate this panel discussion. And the two panelists are Phil Handy, who I've gotten to know in his role as chair of the State Board of Education in Florida a number of years ago, and had an opportunity to work very closely with him on a number of issues, including issues around college and career readiness. And Roberto Rodriguez, who is the special assistant to the president for education policy in the White House. Got to know Roberto in his days as advisor to Senator Kennedy. So had an opportunity to work with all three of these people, and we've had a wonderful opportunity to really frame issues and frame an agenda going forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Ginny to take over the panel.
Good afternoon. Great to see you all. I'm glad to be here. I have like 10 pages of notes and questions, which is really dopey for a conversation that's only going to last what seems like a blink of an eye. In addition to being the editor of EdWeek, I'm the president of the nonprofit that publishes EdWeek and edweek.org and a bunch of other stuff to put my pitch in for my folks and what we do. So my 2 minutes of framing for this session is that we truly have arrived at a spectacular moment in time in education. And I know this sounds like the big picture that you all have been hearing for even years now, much less the last couple of days. But I think it's important for our frame to be able to start out acknowledging that. On the negative side, we still have a very tight economy, but I think it offers a huge opportunity for creativity and promise of greater efficiencies and productivity. But that said, lots of other issues are spurring states and districts to action, not the least of which is the universal focus among states and districts on this agenda of college and career readiness. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And the other big picture point I'd like to make is, so you know the sector of the economy that I'm a part of? Media, publishing, journalism. Can you imagine almost a more disrupted sector of the economy? How about that, Phil? You can chime in on that in a minute. It's really, I'm an advocate for change is really what this means. You've got to change, I think, or you'll not be relevant going forward. So some of the context for me in this questioning will have that frame around it as well. So now I'm going to give these guys, here's the format for this session, is I'm going to ask these guys to introduce themselves, taking only 2 to 3 minutes. I hope I modeled that, and answer the question of what college and career readiness means to them, given their positions and the agendas they're trying to further. And then I'm going to rat-a-tat-tat several questions, ask them to answer very briefly with a minute or two so that we can get through some topics, and then we're going to open it up, okay? So, Phil, why don't you start? Introduce yourself and talk about college and career readiness.
Good morning, glad to be here. I'm Phil Handy, I live in Orlando, Florida, and Ketchum, Idaho, and so I have feet in both camps.
What would those camps be?
The mountains and the sea. The mountains and the lake. I was the chairman of the State Board of Education in Florida from 1998 to 2006. I sit on the board of the Foundation for Florida's Future, which is Jeb's board, and I have since 1994, actually, when he lost his first election. We set up the foundation, started visiting schools, and I sit on the board. I found out after I was elected, I was the first Republican to sit on the board of Stand for Children, which is Jonah Edelman's our organization based in Portland, Oregon. So I've been continued to be highly involved. I serve. This is not a political debate, or is not meant to be framed that way, but I am co-chairman of the Romney Education Advisory Group, so myself and Bill Hansen and Marty West serve as co-chairman of that group. College and career readiness is, for me, is not very simple, but it's be measured. I'll know when we get there, when we stop spending money on remedial education and start getting high school graduation rates up to a reasonable level.
That's great. Roberto?
Yes, well, it's a pleasure to join you this afternoon. My name's Roberto Rodriguez, and I serve President Obama in the White House as Special Assistant for Education on the Domestic Policy Council. And our council and my office is charged with implementing and executing the President's priorities on an agenda that's really to provide a high-quality education for all students from cradle all the way through career. Prior to, I joined the administration in February of 2009. Prior to that, I was serving as Chief Counsel to Senator Kennedy on the Senate HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. And I served the late senator for 8 years working on his education agenda, beginning with the work that we did on the crafting the No Child Left Behind Act with then President Bush. Prior to that, I also wore a hat in the advocacy community in education at the National Council La Raza, where we co-chaired a large number of organizations working on issues such as elementary and secondary education and the then reauthorization. Your question, Ginny, on college and career readiness, I think really boils down for me to one clear imperative of really securing our economic competitiveness moving forward. And certainly that's where the President begins and ends this conversation, is in making sure that not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the necessary thing to do, we need to really elevate the expectations across our system for our students, for the adults in the system, for our parents, for everyone, to focus on college and career readiness. And I think getting there means certainly beginning with high standards, and we can talk more about that, but also curriculum.
And let's stick with this connection to workforce development and economic kind of productivity. What specific things would you say need to happen with standards or education more broadly to ensure that?
Well, we know that we have a majority of the fastest growing occupations in the country. Of the 30 fastest growing occupations, at least 15 are require some level of post-secondary education, often a bachelor's degree. And picking up on a point that Phil raised, we know that we have far too many of our young people today who are going into the post-secondary system unprepared for credit-bearing coursework. Right? We lose $3.7 billion a year on that kind of lost cost of remediation as a country. So I think this work has to begin with higher standards, and whether it's through the Common Core or states that set standards, that needs to be the beginning point.
Phil, you want to add something to that?
Well, it's curious that combining the workforce and education, workforce training takes place in the Department of Labor. That probably shouldn't be the case. In terms of combining the agendas. I've always been intrigued that campaigns segregate education separately from economic development, and I don't think that's right. Education is obviously the leading ingredient in a workforce and in jobs going forward.
Do you think that's changing? And here's where I'm going to go with some of this questioning. I've been here all day today, so I heard the stuff this morning, and then I was in one of the breakout sessions. This notion of how we build will for this change and how we build demand for this change. And I'm going to wear my stripes here and say this notion of a PR campaign seems to trivialize, the work it's going to take to build this demand. I mean, how do you think that message is getting through on the connection between the economy and education, and then also what kind of messaging, or how do we build will around these issues? It's for both of you, so whichever one. And we can have a little conversation about this.
Well, in Florida, we've had we're a little bit ahead of most states' curves. We started the FCAT test and had high stakes testing and did a lot of reforms in Florida. So we're a little bit ahead of everybody else. We are going to, the idea of higher standards and accountability and changing is sort of incompatible with politics. So the terms of the politicians are shorter than it takes to, and we're clearly about in Florida to and elsewhere all throughout the country, as we raise the standards, we're going to see lower scores and lower achievement. So correlating political will with that is going to be very difficult. It's going to happen hopefully at the state level, but we're seeing the necessity. We have a $300,000 grant from the Gates Foundation to actually try to model the situation that's going to unfold in the next.
What are the couple or a few of the tactics that are included in that?
Let me just say that in Florida, we have 67 school districts, and half of them have passed a non-testing resolution, the famous, hopefully you've all seen that. So we're already beginning to see, we can't decide whether we should be an offense or defense, because we're really, we're sort of already seeing the backlash from all of this. So it is a PR campaign, it is a campaign, and it's going to go on for the next 2 or 3 years.
But do you have, well, okay, Roberto, you.
Well, I'll just say, to the broader point around the appreciation of the inextricable link here between education and the economy, I think we still have a long way to go, and we're certainly trying to set the table. But I think you hear often from business leaders in our nation the importance and the challenge that the skills gap creates. But often we have this conversation about education reform in a completely different setting and context, and there's this notion of approaching education as an altruistic function rather than approaching education as the necessary path to secure our competitiveness. And I think the more we can bring more of those pieces together, and that's beginning in higher education. Actually, we're doing a lot to try to really build partnerships between our community colleges and other higher education leaders and business leaders. But I think that we need to focus on that in K-12.
Okay, so let's talk about this looming backlash that's already started, and what tactically folks can do and are already doing in different states and communities and even schools to prepare for that whiplash that's going to occur.
Well, the irony is that it requires education. The organization Stand for Children is involved in parent education in their 10 states. It takes advocacy. You need to be on offense. When I was chairman of the Board of Education, I thought we should have a marketing department as opposed to an incoming department. And I think we need to start thinking like that. We need to be on offense as it relates to these movements and as it relates to higher standards in all the states. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen. And we have to get into the right mindset before we expect the population, our parents, and our kids to be in the right mindset.
Is the administration preparing?
Well, we are. I think the president has an agenda that's a bold, ambitious agenda. It's one that begins where you began, Ginny, around change and the need to recognize that there needs to be change in our schools and across our system because the status quo just is not acceptable. We have an achievement gap that's a serious economic threat moving forward. We have countries outpacing our progress. And when you link that to the job market moving forward, it's clear we have to do better. That's going to require, I think, making sure that we put students first in the reform process, and obviously we do more to engage our parents. I think that public will needs to be there, but it also means being courageous about not just challenging conventional political notions, and the president has been very willing to challenge our traditional party orthodoxy on some key issues, and we can get into those. But I think it also requires building bridges to try to forge a more bipartisan approach here. I think we have to look at what we can do to bring people together around practical challenges. And I think we've certainly tried to do that at the federal level. We've also tried to foster that type of pragmatism, that bipartisanship at the local level, working with governors, Republicans and Democrats to
So
move forward.
I have a couple of other big picture questions, but you teed it up, Roberto, with the idea of the unions as needing to be at the table in this effort to change and push things forward. How's Chicago working out for you?
Well, I'm not. That's a good question. We are all going to stay tuned to see where we end up in Chicago. I'm not going to talk about the particulars of that, but I will talk about, the importance of, I think there's this notion that, either teachers are part of the process or they're not part of the process, and you either are, as an administration, going to embrace the status quo, or you're going to shun the status quo and work outside of that system. And we've really tried to say, look, there are important reforms that we have to move forward because they're right for kids. We have to do more to raise our standards. We have to do more to reshape teacher evaluation, support advancement. Our administration strongly supports alternate compensation programs and other rewards for successful teachers, better ways to identify our most successful, those that need the most help. Successful, high-quality public charter schools, another important notion. Those don't have tremendous appeal sometimes to labor, but at the same time, we believe that you can execute those reforms by bringing folks, including teachers and their unions, to the table and being partners there.
Right. And Phil, so you
So
weigh in on that.
Governor Romney's put out a white paper on K-12, and I would just make the point that we saw the need for significant change, disruptive change, which I think you're referring to. Federal government is in K-12 8-10% of the total school budget, primarily dominated by Title I money. And we made the proposition, and sort of the cornerstone of our ideas is that the money goes directly to the kids and to their parents. And that's disruptive. And that's breaking the status quo. That's not putting it, it's not very, some people don't like the idea, but it's a big idea, and it is highly disruptive from the federal standpoint. I would say that that's the kind of change that we see necessary in order to get the federal government engaged, even further engaged in this process.
And so how do you respond to the folks who say that is a pulling back on the commitment to public education?
We're not suggesting less money. We're suggesting that it go to a different, giving parents the right to choose where their kids go to school is, we think, a further commitment to public education at K-12 level.
So a series of questions that I was wanting to ask in the context of college and career ready kinds of that agenda, and then just more generally is the role of the federal government, right? What the power distribution among the feds, the states, and then even into the districts and schools. So Roberto, I don't know if you want to talk about and it's evolved over, we know, all of us know the story of the evolution of that power shift.
It certainly has evolved. I mean, I think we need to look at where we are with respect to our current education reform efforts and look back, I'd say 10, 15 years. A lot of these efforts began in the states. They began with convenings of governors, Governor Clinton then and others coming together and saying and recognizing the imperative to really begin to drive change in the system. And that's led through efforts through the Clinton and Bush administrations, most recently with No Child Left Behind. What our administrations tried to do is very practically say we need to it's time to forge a new federal-state partnership. We know that we need to be able to enable states to be innovators in education. We can't have, we invest less than 10 cents on the dollar at the federal level. So at the same time, we have and believe there needs to continue to be a strong imperative for accountability and for equity. Those were kind of the moorings of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We believe they're the right ones. We need to move forward. But we need to also be able to be more flexible with the states to enable them to establish a better accountability system, a next generation, if you will, of standards-based reform.
So if ESEA if you could rewrite ESCA today and incorporate.
We need to.
And incorporate, so we've got the waivers going now.
Right.
Something going on with the waivers is what you see needing to happen with a rewritten ESCA
Well, let
accountability?
me say that we're really proud of the work we've been able to do. We have over 30 states that are now going to participate in the ESCA waiver process. And this enables, it's a very clear bargain here. We will give you flexibility from some of the particulars around the mandates for 2014 under AYP, around some of the mandates around set-asides for particular funds, whether that's professional development, supplemental services, other things, in exchange for a very clear commitment to implement and actually execute college and career-ready standards, redesign their teacher evaluation systems so that they're really prepared and calibrated toward teacher effectiveness, and a clear focus on our low-performing schools. And this is another one where I think there's a little difference in approach in terms of some ideas that say, well, we're going to make sure that we're providing parents the entire choice here, and we stand behind school choice. It's an important part of our agenda. But at the same time, we can't turn our back on the need to really transform these 1,700 schools, for instance, that produce over half of our dropouts. So, that's been our formula. We started with Congress. We, spent a good deal of amount of time and effort in Congress trying to forge a legislative reauthorization. We'll continue to work with Congress, but we believe that our kids and our teachers and our state administrators and others, our educators, can't wait. And No Child Left Behind is long overdue for a reauthorization.
So specifically, Phil, on accountability, what would you say a new ESCA?
First of all, I take your point with being part of the media that you're trying to already change the nomenclature for NCLB. It's a terrible brand. It's unfortunately.
Am I getting credit, or am I getting?
No, you're
okay,
getting credit for
okay.
ESCA as opposed to NCLB. So that sounds better. I happen to believe if anybody's, which I'm sure you have as a group of, the waivers are very prescriptive. They're not. I would say they're not. They don't provide all that much flexibility. They're very, very prescriptive, even to the point of having formulas in them that they.
But state specific.
State specific, but right. That wouldn't be a way we go about dealing with reauthorization of NCLB.
So what is the federal role in an accountability context?
Some encouragement, but not mandate. And this organization sort of is absolutely at the point of that. I mean, Chief tries very, very hard to say over and over again that 46 states have opted in. This is an opt-in program, not an opt-out program. It has to be an opt-in program to work. I'm very much in favor of that.
So I've been hearing in just the past few hours several references to the need for scalability and how do we go from places where certain things are working to be able to roll it out. What do you think the role of the feds or what's the balance of power in this effort to have this go to scale?
Well, I think we're going to see change in real time begin to scale as these ESCA waiver states move forward. I mean, we're beginning to see that already, honestly, with Race to the Top. And I think if you look at the 19 states that are forging ahead with a comprehensive systemic reform of their system, and that began by saying, placing a really high priority actually on college and career-ready standards is the first step there. But I think with the implementation of the waivers, I believe we're going to begin to see new models of accountability that are focused on growth and not necessarily on 2014 as the goal here, but on college and career readiness as the goal. I think we're going to begin to see new strides on teacher evaluation and effectiveness, new systems to identify those teachers that need the most help and and hopefully investments in helping to support the development and further growth of the education workforce. And we're already beginning to see serious action and change in some of our persistently low-performing schools. These are schools where, I mean, it's just when you look at some of the neighborhoods around these schools, and the president visited one of these schools actually with former Florida Governor Jeb Bush a couple years ago down in Miami Central. Around some of these schools, you see generations of kids being left behind, where parents graduated from that school without a college and career-ready education, and whose child is going to that school and still being denied that chance. And there is both a strong economic but also moral imperative for change there. So I'm excited about the progress we're already starting to see. I think our federal role, to get back to your question, Ginny, I'm sorry I'm meandering here, but our federal role here is to lift up that work.
Well, I was just, so Phil, I'll let you speak directly to the question of the federal role, not only just to lift up, but to, how specifically does that happen? Because, I've been at this a long time, and just saying it or showing it doesn't make it so.
Yeah, in fact, the empirical evidence is that it doesn't really happen. I mean, the real reform in America has come in Indiana, Louisiana, Florida, where we've changed legislatures, we've changed school boards, we've changed leadership, changed governance, and I don't view any of those things as the purview of the federal government.
I have a couple more questions, but I want you all to be thinking about what you'd like to ask these folks. The role of technology and what you see either, I keep coming back to this federal role because I think that's where you guys need to be starting, but just in general, if you want to say something about.
Well, I would just say, technology is an important innovator, and again, what we lack in the education sector is the capacity to test, refine, redevelop, and scale ultimately practices that work well to close the achievement gap, that work well in classrooms. And this is something that I think the private sector does very well because they spend a good amount of their resources, time, and energy on it. We have not historically had that capacity. So we believe our federal role needs to be to drive that innovation. We need to be a place where districts and universities and other education partners can come to really have a partner in innovation, in identifying what works, in scaling that, in developing and refining and discovering really the next generation of solutions for our classroom. And I believe technology is one of those.
Phil, with Governor Bush and...
Well, in technology, I think we're the first state or one of the first states to pass a law that requires all kids to take one course, virtual class, and we did virtual education. Idaho's just passed a law that requires two, which the teachers' unions have a referendum on the ballot to reverse. So they don't like that at all. And back to your point about the crisis, the economic crisis, I think nothing will drive technology probably more than creating demand. So asking kids to take at least one course will create the supply to meet the demand, and the fact that we need to get more efficiency out of the process. We can't have this model be the driving force for us anymore. So economics will actually drive, I believe, at the state level, technology.
So my last question is, you guys keep teeing up the questions nicely. I personally am getting pushback as editor of Ed Week because we have started to cover the world of business and industry in K-12 education. That somehow is an indication, I'm wearing my feelings on my sleeve here, that we somehow are pulling back from our commitment to public education, whatever that means. And so talk about this feeling out there lately about the privatization of education on one hand and the commitment to public education on the other as somehow a dichotomous way of looking at, education in America.
So, public education is one of the last monopolies left in America. It doesn't work. It is ultimately bound for failure, which is what we're all struggling with. I think competition is very healthy, and that will come from the private sector. It will come from the public sector too. There's plenty of nonprofits, but it'll come from the private sector. And I applaud the juxtaposition of having, as I said in Florida, we've created demand, and the supply will not be met by the public sector, but it will be met by the private sector.
You want to add to that, Roberto?
Well, I would take a slightly different view there than Phil, at least on this point, right? I do believe that, our public education system is a hallmark of our democracy. This is one of the most important institutions that we have, not just to prepare our young people for colleges and career, but also to prepare them to participate fully in their democracy, in their communities. And it's important that we look at how our public education sector and this public sector can learn from the private sector more, and certainly welcome in new innovations and new ideas. We believe that our public education sector needs to be much more nimble and much more open to ideas and to change. But that is not to say that we believe that it needs to be replaced with a new system. I think there's a lot of change that we can imbue within the system with good lessons from our public and our private partners. I also would say that if you look at competition alone, we can look back at the theory here that's not proven effective in terms of creating large-scale change in our system. So our support, for instance, as an administration for things such as successful public charter schools is not necessarily driven by a desire to fuel competition in the system as much as it is to create places for new ideas, new autonomy, and innovation to be able to bring back into the system and improve it.
30-second rebuttal.
Very, very disruptive idea, but it is at the essence of our nuanced philosophical differences. I don't believe that a child should be destined to go to a school in which they're born into a zip code. They should have the choice to move from district to district. They should be able to go to private. They should be able to go public. There's 53 varieties of milk in the grocery store. We should have parents and children should have a choice.
All right, you all can ask the even harder questions, or Superintendent Holliday.
Hi, I'm Caroline King from Washington State. Work for a nonprofit, Washington STEM, for science, technology, engineering, and math. You both talked about the importance of bridging education and the economy. STEM fields is where that comes together front and center, where we have jobs growing 3 times faster in important fields like cyber security and aerospace and alternative energy, and yet it's where education outcomes are lagging the most, both in K-12 and degree production at the post-secondary level. So could you both comment on what you think the role of the federal government should be in the STEM arena?
So I'm glad you asked the question, thank you. I think we need to begin obviously by doing more to really make sure that our young people are prepared to compete for those jobs that you mentioned. And I think a clear imperative there is making sure we have very robust science and mathematics instruction, and we up our game, so to speak. And I just want to take a moment to applaud ADP and Achieve for the work there. I mean, they've been setting the table to be able to try to do that for years now. It's really important. We also, though, and if you look at this in the context of college and career-ready standards, we need to be sure that we're not losing, and in fact, we're implementing fully our CCR standards alongside real robust teaching and learning that will produce strong collaborators, creators, problem solvers, critical thinkers these skills and this deeper set of knowledge needs to be reflected in how our college and career ready standards are being implemented, because those are the skills that our STEM field needs to be able to thrive and be successful. The president has called for recruiting, and you heard him talk about this most recently at the convention, recruiting 100,000 new science and math teachers moving forward over the decade. He's also called for a new STEM Master Teacher Corps. That is a new effort to really recognize and reward and hold up our most successful science and math teachers in classrooms around the country, and use those folks as resources to really drive a transformation and a renaissance of teaching in math and science.
Phil.
In Florida, we grade our schools A through F, which is an important distinction. And we started with writing and reading and math and added science 2 years ago to the calculation. When we established science, I don't probably need to tell you this, but the standards were at a reasonable level, and the kids knew so little about science that we had to create a cut score of 50 in order to make it reasonable. I mean, our kids didn't know anything about science, so we totally agree on that. We have the disadvantage as a candidate or as a president that we're probably not going to be able to create the billion-dollar programs that we applaud them, and I think that creating STEM teachers are right. ExxonMobil, put $200 or $300 million into a program to incent kids to take STEM and to incent teachers to teach STEM. We view that much more as the model than it is to have the federal government do that. But we certainly agree on what the outcome should be.
Differentiated salaries.
And you could
Yes.
make the point. I make the point. You can, as opposed to adding to the process, you can differentiate salaries to encourage teachers to go that way. By the way, I just got back from Washington, and Washington is one of the 6 states in America that doesn't allow charter schools. So I wish you luck on your referendum for charter schools.
Ginny, if I could just interject one more point here, which I know this is a crowd focused on K-12 reform and change, but maintaining our competitiveness in STEM really requires a reexamination of teaching 9th and 10th grade, these entry-level courses, in particular in mathematics, right, at our higher education institutions. That's just an area that we are going to be looking forward to driving real reform in.
That's great. Terry?
Well, they tell me there are 10 states that don't have charters, and Kentucky's one of them.
Good luck.
I have supported charters with the concept of parental engagement. When a parent goes into the grocery store and looks at 53 different kinds of milk, they get to choose one, but they're engaged. But also that parent knows that there's some quality control around all that milk. So what's the federal role in the quality control of those things? And then the second part of that question, whether we're 23rd in math or 24th in science or 32nd in whatever, give me one of those countries that would deregulate and focus on choice and has done so that's ahead of us, and what research was behind that. That would be my question for the deregulation and tax, and that's what you're doing, is we deregulate to allow choice, and we provide a tax through vouchers.
I guess that question is addressed at me.
No, well, Roberto can answer it. Also.
I'll let Phil take this one.
First of all, I don't think there's any federal role in quality control. I think there's a state role for that, and I believe it can be conducted by your office, and it happened in Florida. And if there's any controversy about that, it comes to the State Board of Education, and it's adjudicated there. As it relates to choice, I would say that there's plenty of examples where it has worked, whether it be Finland or whether it's been Singapore. There's been examples where we would trade with them as it relates to their model and their teaching models. I think they're good examples for us, and I believe that, by the way, that that education is not an anomaly to the rest of the economy. I mean, I believe that choice has worked, competition choice has worked in the economy in every single industrial and service sector in America, and education shouldn't be an anomaly to that.
So here, let me also just pose what I think is a fair question on this point, which is, why do we have charter schools? Why, if we look back at the origins of the charter movement, I think there's certainly choice was part of those origins, but also the sense that we weren't able to really have the space in large part in many of our public education systems and traditional systems to be able to really test new ideas and develop new innovations and bring them to scale. And I think our challenge today is not how do we create a new system outside of our public schools, but instead how do we ensure that from a systemic perspective, that the lessons that we are seeing coming out of high-performing and successful charter schools are brought back into our system, that we learn from those lessons, that we think about, you look at expanding the school day maybe as just one example of that, but also how we continue to be strong stewards at the federal level and at the state level to accountability for all of our students. And we have a whole set of state level charter laws. Certainly our administration doesn't propose reversing that, but we do believe that authorizers have a public responsibility to make sure that those charters that are authorized are high quality, accountable schools to the students and the parents they serve.
So the quality control would be at the state level in your
yes,
estimation
but
as well?
I think we have a role at the federal level to make sure that our state and local actors are doing more to advance accountability and quality.
By the
in
way,
charter sector.
everybody that has money has a choice, and I think and we should change that and do away with the hypocrisy that just because you have enough money, you have the choice to where to send your kids to school. I think everybody should have that choice. It seems radical from a class standpoint, but I actually believe that everybody should have that choice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to stick with that theme and particularly to Phil, and not to ignore you, Roberto, but
Okay, Mitch.
there's a really provocative piece in the platform, in the governor's platform related to choice, which is the inter-district component of that.
Right.
Which I think a lot of us have thought about over the last number of decades, the possibility of thinking about school solutions beyond municipal boundaries. But you could also view that piece in the platform as kind of cynical, a bit of a throwaway. I mean, what's the likelihood that suburban communities are going to open up their doors to poor minority kids from low-performing urban districts? We had a little bit of a taste of it with No Child Left Behind, with the choice provision, which encouraged states to think about cross-district choice, and I think the evidence was that very little of that happened. Can you tell us what the thinking is there, and how central is that notion to the platform? Is it just a throwaway?
It's not a throw. I guess yeah, right. It's not a throwaway. It was very profoundly considered because we understood the implications of all the tax implications, all the equity in the implications of that. I believe that they can be worked out if the state is ready to do that. We're giving the parents the right to drive that process. I'll just return to the theme. I think it is highly disruptive and highly necessary. And unless we do something like that, we're bound to see, as you talked about, not you, but was talked about in the last session, the same 1,700 schools 10 years from now. I believe that's going to happen. And I wish it weren't, but I think it will. So we're trying to give the power to the parents, trying to, one could argue that Title I money is only a couple $1,000s each will drive behavior, and we believe it will.
Are you both sanguine that we'll be, no matter what happens with the election, no matter what happens with any backlash that may occur as test scores start coming out, that this agenda will be further along, 3 years from now than it is today? What are the impediments? What are the challenges you most would keep you up at night on this agenda?
School boards and school boards, superintendents. It was a very interesting dynamic. We proposed the parent trigger law, we call parent empowerment law. In Florida, it passed the House. It didn't pass the Senate 20-20. But more importantly, how institutions lined up on the bill was extraordinarily interesting. So with the Black Caucus was for it. The School Board Association was against it. The school superintendents were against it. The PTA was against it. The Common Cause was against it. And so I think we're developing a whole new dynamic in the, certainly this administration has opened huge gaps and huge new achievements in terms of reestablishing the political alliances, for which I applaud them. But I think we have our work cut out for us. As I said at the beginning, I don't know whether, I'd like to think we should all be on offense, but boy, we have a lot of defense to play before we get there.
There are people digging in, you think?
I think this passing, I'm sure everybody's aware of it. If you're not, you should. But there is a resolution, and not an anti-testing resolution nationally, which has been converted into local resolutions that is getting in the parliaments, getting a lot of traction. And school boards who are against power and empowerment and choice are passing those resolutions. I think it, sort of sets up a little fence for, more than a little fence for what we have in front of us, right. And we got to get over that one to get to where we want to go.
What keeps you up at night, Roberto?
Well, a lot of things, but I'll say I do believe, to your broader question, Ginny, we will be better off 3 years from now than we are. I think we are on a forward trajectory. This is a long-term game, not a short-term game that we need to play here with respect to college and career readiness and college and career ready standards. But just alone, if we look at where we were 4 years ago, or let's go back, 7 years ago, when we had states that actually were lowering standards in reading or math because of some of the incentives under No Child Left Behind, and have since to today, where we have an overwhelming majority of states that are participating in the Common Core, and even states that aren't participating, we are laboring to give them a pathway toward demonstrating that their standards are college and career ready. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the threat, so just that alone, raising the bar, raising those expectations, will, I think, put us in a better place. I worry that we need to, with the same level of effort and determination that we set those standards, that the state set those standards, we need to come in with a focus on new teaching and learning to those standards. And that means we need to really build the capacity within our systems to be able to implement those standards, to be successful. And the thing that keeps me up, that I worry about, is once that gets down to the local level, there are inherently always there are going to be challenges there around ownership, around who controls what. There still are challenges around and resistance to the federal government having anything to say around whether standards should be college and career ready. So that is a very live debate and I worry about that potentially setting the clock back.
Right.
Because it's a conversation that's about the politics of who controls our schools instead of a conversation about what's best for our
Well,
kids.
much less real implementation
Yes.
challenges.
Yeah, we have real
So-
challenges. I mean, Phil talked about the assessment challenges and kind of the referendums on testing. That's a real challenge, and I think it's also I think it's emblematic of a bigger issue around the need to really implement better, higher quality assessments.
Bill,
Right?
last word.
Plenty to celebrate. We're so far in the last 4 or 8 years, pick the time, but think about Indiana and Louisiana and Oklahoma, and just the chiefs are changed, and all the things that have happened was plenty to celebrate. The fight is never done, and we have a fight ahead of us.
I just got 5 more minutes. I was ready to produce myself here. Another question from the audience? Actually, I'm going to take this as found time and let's thank our panelists for joining us today.